Proportional Response, Book 1, Chapter 14, Part 2, The Field of Honor. Hannibal held his breath and felt his hand twitch for Vashna's again. I should be the one expecting to give her support, not the other way around. Some small part of his mind chuckled at him, and he forced himself to breath as he watched his friend. Henry did not seem to react at all for several moments, and he could see the wheels churning. What did this man do? Did he personally injure Henry somehow? After a few moments, the Duke spoke, his voice heavy with a ritualistic intonation.
This man comes before you laying bare and invokes the right of trial by combat to prove that he has become more than he was. Will you deny him?
Fury flashed in Henry's eyes, but then they softened and he looked at Kasla.
Very well. He wishes to prove something. Let him advance to the list field and show his worth.
Henry made an abrupt turn and began to stalk onto the field, pulling his helm on as he did so. Hannibal looked over at his aunt and saw her give Henry an encouraging smile. He could tell when Henry saw it. Some of the stiffness went out of his brother's step, and he felt a small flush of pride. I do think I did well by them. A small noise, barely audible and fully unintelligible, came from behind him and nearly put a blush on his hands. Vashna had seen it and voiced her own approval. Another voice floated in from the side of the field, hard as steel and soft but penetrating through the semi-darkness.
No.
No one moved. Even the dancing flames of the torches seemed to still. He could feel the Duke searching in anger for the owner of that voice. The Colonel stepped onto the field, his helm already strapped down and sword in hand.
Henry, on the one hand, you are my charge, and my principal job is your safety. On the other hand, though both of us are knighted, you know I am the better fighter. If anyone is going to face this brigand on the field, it will be me.
Everyone in the scene took a collective breath. Hannibal could tell the moment his brother looked at Eldia. The barest looks of pleading, then approval, and then acceptance flashed across her eyes. Henry looked at the ground for a moment, squared his shoulders, and turned to the Colonel. There is something the Colonel did not mention. Henry will probably be able to learn more from observation of the fight than he would learn actually fighting the man. I knew the Colonel was a shrewd man, but I will have to upgrade his rating with our intel services. The two of them locked eyes for a few moments. Someone who didn't know Henry as well as he did might have taken that stare for a contest of wills, but Hannibal could almost hear the volumes of conversation which passed between them. Neither liked the situation, both intended to have some serious words with the Duke, and gulp possibly with him sometime soon, but the silent conversation ended with curt nod. Hannibal had to force himself to breathe. They have agreed to give John a fair shot to prove his worth. He risked a glance at the Duke and found a mask of stone had settled over the man's features. Why is this so important? I know he has grown a certain grudging fondness for this human, but there is still an edge in all of their dealings. The Colonel stood in the middle of the list field while John advanced. The rest of the humans stood at the edge of the field, almost touching the rope which marked it off. Hannibal stepped up with the Duke and switched places with Lady Golna so she could stand with her husband and he could stand with Vashna. He quietly slipped his hand into hers and saw her look up at him. His doubt and fear met with curiosity and confidence, and some of her calm rubbed off on him. How does she do that? The girl has the courage of a Jimper. He looked over at Henry, and his friend turned hard eyes on him. He shrugged and motioned to the Duke. His friend nodded, and turned furious eyes on Caslaw, who returned the look with one that spoke of both apology and resolve. Eldia leaned over and whispered something in Henry's ear, and he shot her a hard look as well before he turned his eyes back to the field. Euro grabbed a marshalling staff, stepped onto the field, and held the staff out between the two men. Her voice seemed to ring through the hush that had fallen over the courtyard.
Gentlemen.
Some grumbling came from the humans at the use of the word, but no one spoke out.
You stand on the field of honor, to fight with honor, and in proof of your worth. Do you both swear to fight with valor and gallantry?
Two human voices boomed across the night.
Do you vow to fight with honor? Aye. Do you stand properly armed and armored? Aye. Are you satisfied with your opponent's arms and armor? Aye. Then, for honor and glory, I charge you, lay on.
She backpedaled while pulling the staff upward and away with a flourish. The two men began to circle slowly, one way then the other. Finally, John's sword twitched, and the colonel struck like a viper. The sound of wood on helmet rang through the night. The blow staggered the human, who stopped, backed up a step, hollered, "Good," then brought his guard up and started moving again. Well, at least he acknowledges his blow when it is obvious. This time, John actually struck out, and again, the colonel struck his helm, though not as hard this time, and again, John acknowledged the hit loud and clear. Hannibal began to watch Henry instead of the fight. Several times he heard wood meet metal, and didn't have to look to know who had been hit. Each hit seemed lighter than the last, but each time, John's voice came out just as strong. "Henry, my brother, what is it that Caslor wishes you to learn from this? What is it you see?" He turned back to the fight to see the colonel's blade land directly, again, on John's helm, but no ring issued forth. John continued to circle and hollered, "Light!" He frowned, but saw Vashna and Henry nod in approval. After a moment, the colonel nodded as well, then struck without warning, right behind John's shield and into the meat of the man's leg. John dropped immediately to his knees. The colonel squared up, and they exchanged blows for a moment, before a loud thump sounded on John's back. This time, John cried out in surprise and pain before he shouted, "Good!" And he heard Vashna mutter something under her breath about it getting interesting. John stood, and they circled some more. The colonel obviously outmatches John, but still, they fight. Why? Another wet thwack sounded as the colonel made contact with John's arm. The human threw down his shield and switched the sword to that hand, but Hannibal could see fury in the man's movements. The two moved together, and this time a thrust took John so hard in the chest he staggered backward several steps. Hannibal could hear anger in the man's voice as he acknowledged the blow. The colonel stepped back to allow John to retrieve his shield, then started in again. 5 more times they closed, 5 more times the colonel's blade met unarmored flesh, and each time John's cries grew angrier and more irritated. Hannibal shifted from foot to foot and had to fight a desire to rush out and stop the fight. Vashna leaned over and muttered so only he could hear, "There is a purpose to this, and it is almost over. In fact, I expect, yes, now." He saw it as she spoke. His months of watching the fighting finally paid off, and he saw the colonel drop his shield just a little too far. Everyone else seemed to see it as well, and silence hung in the air as John's sword came out like a whip at the tiny opening. The blade sped unerringly towards the tiny opening, and Hannibal felt himself cheering for the underdog, ready for the hit, when Henry's voice rang out across the field. "Hold!" John had already committed. He had no way to stop the blow without risking damaged muscles. Instead, the man backed up a step and turned the shot so that it lightly tapped the colonel's shield rather than crashing into the man's helm. Everything hung in still for a moment. Then John let out a cry of frustration and spun, fury obvious in his every move, to stare at Henry, who stood straight, nodded to the man, and then picked up his sword and shield. What? Henry is going to fight him now? That seemed to be what John expected, because the man brought his guard up and stood waiting. Henry did not advance, however. Instead, he beat his sword into his shield. Hannibal watched, curious, as his friend waited a few moments, then did it again. Another pause, slightly shorter this time, and another impact. This time, the Duke had picked up sword and shield and joined him. Another pause, and the colonel joined in. Another, shorter pause, and several of the humans joined. Within 3 more impacts, all of the humans had begun to beat their shields, faster and faster, and a roar of approval began to rise from the crowd. Henry walked forward, the odd sort of clapping coming continuously now, until he stood close enough to John to touch. The Duke strode out to meet them. Hannibal started as Vashna slapped him on the butt, then pushed him out to walk with Kasler, who then raised his sword high. The deafening clamor ended as if it had never been. Enable stood there, trying not to shift back and forth on his feet, and realized that Vashna had followed him out when Henry's eyes flicked to her before he locked eyes with Kasler, who gave the barest hint of a shrug. Henry narrowed his eyes, then turned to John. The man stooped slightly, panting with fatigue, but fury still burned in his eyes as Henry spoke.
I have a record of your crimes, and I attended the funeral of more than one good man whom you killed. I promised their widows that you would see justice. Don't think that your display here today, the fact that you at least seem to have learned something of honor, will belay that promise.
Enable sensed, more than saw, the Duke shift his weight. Henry did not budge, but his countenance softened slightly.
You have, however, earned my willingness to listen. You have learned enough of honor to take the field today and act against your fury, and so I will take on faith, for the moment, that you have seen the error of your ways. So, since I don't believe His Grace would have brought you to me without a good reason, and you have bought yourself my willingness to listen, why don't you tell me what this is all about?
John now stood ramrod straight, and met Henry's gaze with a hard countenance of his own. The man began to speak, but Kasler held up a hand.
Henry, I appreciate that you trust me enough to understand that I wouldn't have put us all through this.
He made a sweeping gesture with his hand.
Without good reason. You are right when you discern the reason is because you need to hear what this man has to say. However, this man has a great deal you need to hear, and it would be best said behind closed doors with something less of an audience.
Henry turned his eyes to Kasler, but only his eyes. They stared at one another again, but Henry finally nodded and started towards the nearest door. John turned to follow, and Enable saw Kasler's wives and Eldia do the same. He turned to Vashna and took both her hands in his, kissed her forehead, dropped her hands, mumbled an apology, and began to walk away. Before he could turn, Kasler took a step to them and spoke quietly.
Let her come with us. You aunts attaché should probably hear this as well. Besides, someone should be there to serve the drinks.
Kasler and Vashna exchanged a look that he couldn't begin to read. Then she turned back to smile brightly at him, placed her hand solemnly in his, and walked with him. As soon as everyone had filed into a small room, the colonel entered behind them and closed the door. Kasler motioned to Vashna, and she jumped up to help Henry serve drinks to everyone. Once everyone had been plied with a booze of choice and a glass of water, John began to speak.